Hello and welcome to Kali Live, the podcast. My name is Paula Rogo and I am the founder of Kali Media, a space devoted to telling the stories of women in East Africa. Kali Live, the podcast, is made up of the recordings from our Kali Live event series. And this signature series welcomes notable East African women writers, artists, and thought leaders for vibrant discussions in a live setting. So, on December 7th, 2018, we held our first event. Kali Live hosted the Kenya book launch of Nanjala Nyabola's first book, Digital Democracy, Analogue Politics: How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. This packed event was held on a Friday evening at the main branch of Kenya's National Library. Nanjala was interviewed by friend and journalist Christine Mungai, and then she took questions from the audience. This podcast episode is a recording of that event. Our moderator and interviewer for the evening was journalist and writer Christine Mungai. Christine has written about a wide range of topics, including politics, business, security, education, technology, and culture, for the likes of The Standard, The Star, CNN, Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, The Boston Globe, Mail and Guardian, Rogue Chiefs, and now The Elephant. In 2015, she was named as the first runner-up for the David Astor Journalism Award, a professional development prize for East African print journalists. Christine was also a 2018 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, where she studied the relationship between torture, silence, repression, and how that affects a country's political imagination and media reporting. And now, the author herself. Nanjala is a political analyst, writer, and humanitarian advocate based in Nairobi. Her academic career has focused on forced migration and African politics, and includes 2 master's degrees from the University of Oxford, which she attended as a Rhodes Scholar. She also has a JD from Harvard Law School. She has published extensively, providing both opinion pieces and analysis, as well as being a frequent speaker on contemporary African politics and society. Digital Democracy, Analogue Politics is a book that explores the impact of technology on politics in Kenya and African political agency in the digital era. This recording has been edited for clarity and understanding. And now, let's jump in.
All right, let's get started since we are spending our Friday night here instead of elsewhere, so that there's time for elsewhere, right? I am super excited to be here. When I heard Nanjala was writing a book a long time ago, I said I have to be there at the launch.
She did.
Yeah, so you guys can ask the hard questions. Me, I'm here as a fan. You guys can ask the hard questions, yeah? Seriously though, I am really excited about this. And Nanjala, I guess the way we'll structure this conversation is in 2 parts. First is the craft, the how of getting the book done. Okay. Everyone wants to know that. And then, everyone wants to know that. And then the content of it. Sure. Some of us in this room have read the book. Mm-hmm. I'm suspecting most of us haven't. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's in there and how it got there. Yeah. So tell us about the craft of writing this book. I know that it started more than 10 years ago. Yes. As I thought, more than 10 years ago. The book is kind of bookended by 2 elections, 2007 and 2017. And the book covers the 10 years in the middle. So what was the writing process like? Were you taking notes as things were happening? Did you go back and try and research stuff? Yeah. Tell us a little about that.
First of all, I'm so happy to see all of you here, and I'm so happy that many of you are here for the first time. I used to come to this place all the time when I was a kid. I used to take the number 34 bus from Langata all the way down here, and then walk and just sit in this kids section because it was the cleanest section. And for me, public space is so important, and using public space is a political act. And I really hope that this is the start. Maybe the lights will get fixed, and more people will be able to use these spaces, because we really have to take back our public spaces, and we really have to make use of them. So thank you so much for making the time to be here this evening. To answer your question, all the way, I guess, I started university in 2005, and all the way until 2007, I was going to be an investment banker. I know. Because that's what you do, right? When you grow up in a country like Kenya and you have some academic promise, and you find the way to turn that into money very quickly. And the thing about studying in the UK is there are jobs that have paths. There's management consulting and banking, investment banking, and there's all that recruitment. So it's like, here's a path. I can follow this path and I can convert this into returns very quickly. And then I came home for the election for the first time I've ever come home since I left. And it was, many of you were here. It was the most traumatic experience I think I've ever been through. As I said, I used to live in Langata, so December 30th, we're looking at the horizon and it's just orange because all the houses in Kibera are burning. And you're sitting in your house thinking, are we gonna be okay? Like, is this it? This is how we become Rwanda, we become Somalia, we become all of these countries that we've spent most of our childhood saying, at least, at least, at least. And I went back with a renewed sense of purpose. And I knew that I had to do something differently because for me, something really fundamental shifted on those first weeks of January. And I wanted to do something that would pull us back from the edge, if that makes sense. It felt like, because when it turns out, when your country is on fire, nobody says, guys, get the investment bankers. Turns out. And it just really made me think, how can I be useful in this context? What can I do in this context? So went back and started what turned out to be a decade-long project of trying to understand what brings societies to that point. And it has really been a decades-long project. It started with writing. Some of you here concerned Kenyan writers. It started with Kenya Imagine. It started with all of these platforms, writing, and seeing that writing was actually doing something, was changing the conversation somehow, and research, and kept evolving until my second master's thesis, which was really where everything's supposed to come together. It was like, what I noticed in those 3 months was that there were so many women writing on the internet and so few writing in the paper. And I was like, and I've lived this, right? Because I kept trying to get someone's attention at the papers and I couldn't get anyone's attention. And I was like, how is it that I can write a blog post for these blogs every week if I want to, and I can't get a single spot in the paper? And that was the genesis of it all. The master's thesis was about how the internet made it possible for women to write. And as I say in my introduction, Chris has read the introduction, so she knows how this goes. My university hated the subject. Hated the subject. We fought. Why don't you want to write about markets? Why don't you want to write about rural communities? Why don't you want to write about... I was like, wait, what? Why don't you... The phrase that burns in my brain, you know when Christine Blasey Ford said, what is it? But seared in the hippocampus. Seared in my hippocampus is the phrase, these are middle-class concerns. Because I thought, wait, I'm born in Nairobi. I grew up in Nairobi. I was part of this community. I was in this community. You're telling me that my life doesn't exist. You're telling me that my life doesn't matter. And this is not a normative statement. This is not saying rural lives are less important or urban lives are more important or women's lives are more. This is really just a qualitative statement on what academia is on Africa. And the idea that my view was not valid because it was not academically valid it wasn't acceptable. You have to go back to the drawing board and write what is academically acceptable. What right, what authority does this institution have to tell me that my existence is invalid? And left the project alone for a couple of years, and then came back in 2015 and was like, okay, first of all, I still feel like this is important. I still feel like there's something to it. There's something to the ways in which we organize online that is very qualitatively different from the way we organize offline. There's something really different about the conversations that we're having, the communities that we're building, and even the communities we're destroying. There's something there that's important. And it's not what we're being told by Silicon Valley, it's not Silicon Savannah, it's not Konza Tech City. There's something qualitatively there about how we are defining Kenyanness in the digital age, and I'm gonna try and figure out what that something is. And that was the original research question, and that is what became the 3-year process of putting this text together.
Hello, this is Paula again. Sadly, we ran into some technical difficulties at this particular point. So the recording picks back up when Christine is asking Nanjala about her decision to include the My Dress, My Choice campaign from 2015 in a chapter of her book. The campaign began after a woman was brutally attacked and stripped. Here is Christine giving us a brief history of Nairobi city centre and how that history affects how women navigate the CBD today.
And spatial intelligence of a place, right? That we enter physical spaces, sometimes not even really reflecting on what that physical space means. So in the colonial context, Nairobi was a place of migrant male labor. So men came to town, right? And the women who were in town were prostitutes, commercial sex workers, all this stuff, right? So town already has a very normatively male kind of communicative density.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in town, you know that you're in the domain of maleness.
Propriety.
You know, and so in a way you have to conduct yourself accordingly, right? During that time, I wrote an opinion piece for Mail and Guardian, and I said, I analyzed many things, but now I realize what I was saying without really saying it, is that my mom used to tell us, you can dress however you want. She was very kind of liberal about dressing, but she would always say, but be careful about where you're going. Like, you have to dress appropriately for where you're going. So I really love how you were able to kind of tease out the meaning of some of the spaces that we're in. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, what that kind of analytical work is like, and what are some of the surprises that you kind of connected the dots later?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, if you're a Kenyan and you grew up in Nairobi especially, and I have a caveat in the beginning why this is a Nairobi book. It's just 79% of people who are on Twitter in Kenya, for example, live in Nairobi. But that doesn't mean that there's not interesting stuff happening elsewhere, and I would encourage you to check out some of the research that Duncan Omanga is doing at the University of Nairobi, which deals with figures in Nakuru and Garissa who are using social media in interesting ways. But I wanted to read a little bit of that page so that I can have a jumping off point. To understand just how radical the My Dress, My Choice movement was in the context of Kenya's, and indeed Nairobi's history, it's important to chart the evolution of the CBD as a public space through the historical arc that predates even independence. The idea of public sexuality as provocation cannot be separated from the broader discussion on colonization and physical space. It's not a coincidence that so many of these attacks on women happen in the CBD. From its founding in 1899 until independence in 1963, Nairobi was de jure a racially segregated city. African men who lived and worked in Nairobi were not legally allowed to live with their families. And so most of the African inhabitants of the city, even those who worked in the colonialists' homes, were men. At the same time, Africans were not allowed to move within the CBD without wearing a kipande, a metal pass bearing their name and details of their ethnic origin around their necks. Any European had the right to stop a man and demand that he show his pass. Any African found without a pass could be summarily arrested, detained, often tortured, and then returned to the reserves, parenthesis, rural area. The CBD in Nairobi is therefore a historical epicenter for the racial and gender violence of colonial Kenya, a physical manifestation of the subjugation of colonization. And in this context, Black Kenyans, and men especially, were conditioned through violence into approaching the CBD with a certain reverence. This corresponds to Eke's conception of the two publics. The experience of colonialism forces people to present different versions of themselves in different physical or intellectual environments. This multiplicity of identities didn't change after independence. Going to town retains an air of mystique for many Nairobi residents, who are expected to dress up before entering this hallowed space. So for instance, unlike in many other capital cities where women will wear running shoes while commuting and change into heels once they arrive in the office, until recently, Kenyan women would rarely be seen in anything that wouldn't pass for office footwear in the CBD. So the idea of men as beasts with no impulse control is inherent in the physical space of Nairobi CBD. It's the most cosmopolitan place in Kenya, but this cosmopolitan identity is founded in apartheid and the violent exercise of power, as well as repression of any kind of self-expression. The system persists in some form because it continues to benefit some people, just as Kenya's decolonization is incomplete because those who succeeded the colonial administration continue to benefit. Spatial repression persists because it facilitates control, and keeping the CBD pure is integral to preventing its use as a site for earnest political mobilization. So, Monjo, you know where this paragraph starts from was actually my own experience with the CBD. I'm third generation Nairobian. My grandfather worked on the railway. My mom was born in Nairobi. I was born in Nairobi. And there was a day that I was coming from work, and I was working out west, and I broke a heel. I don't even wear heels anymore, but that's another story. I broke a heel, and I went to Bata, and I bought slippers for 100 bob. So that's a logical thing that a human would do. My dear, the drama. The drama that superseded that small action of buying slippers to walk to the bus stop. Why are you dressed like this? People watching you, looking at you like you've lost your mind. And that moment, this is almost 10 years ago now, has never left me. Because it seems it was such a simple action, it was such a apolitical action, that invited so much staring and so much, some comments, actually did get some comments. Madam, umeva viatu gani hiyo? And layered that with the experience of my grandfather, who couldn't live with his family, who had to wear this awful thing around his neck, who really endured a lot of humiliation and violence in the process of trying to make a living in this country. And layering that with the experience of these women who had been, because it's always, when you're told, ladies, correct me if I'm wrong, when you're told where you can wear a sleeveless top, see, there's certain roads that you're told, usivuke Moi Avenue kama umevaa hivyo. Usivuke, and you look at it with layered it with the maps of how Nairobi was racially segregated. Who used to live on the other side of Moi Avenue? Who is it who was being told that they can't control their impulses? And so that's kind of the genesis of this. And this is one of the things that I'm pointing out about how there's so much of me in this book. It's not explicit, it's not, and then I went, and then I did, and then whatever. But that to me is what authentic research about your own society, that's kind of where it comes from, is to be authentic enough to recognize your own experience, your own limitations, to be agnostic about it, but to recognize it and to give it space. I wanted us to start, you'll see a lot of things that are familiar if you grew up in Nairobi. You might see it in Kizungu Mob, but the underlying ideas, the underlying ideas you will recognize. And this is part of my broader political project with my writing. I want to hold space in the archive for stories about people I know, I'm friends with, I'm related to, I hang out with, I buy food from, all of those things. I want to hold space in the archive for us. so that even if we can't complete this research this year, next year, in 5 years, that someone won't have the experience that I had when I went back to the archives of the 2007 post-election violence. And I looked at the archives and I thought, this isn't it. This isn't everything that happened. This isn't how the story played out. There's something that's missing. I went back and read every single opinion piece that was published between January 1st and April 30th. And I was like, what? This ain't it, man. I went to a launch of a book event on the 2013 election, and one professor from a well-known university that shall remain nameless, Nairobi, said the ICC came to intervene in Kenya of their own accord. And I was like, hold the phone. Don't be vague, go to Hague. Did we not do that? Did we not have marches? Did we not have Kitobu Manyara in parliament saying XYZ? Go back to the archives of the ICC process as they are right now in Kenya, and you will be surprised at how much stuff has been erased. That is a driving impetus for my philosophical work. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not trying to make a believer out of you. I am trying to hold that space so that our histories can at least reflect who we are as close as possible to who we actually are. Yeah.
Nanjala, I just want you to hit that point even harder. When you're saying that some of those things are not there anymore, it's that websites have been scrubbed, right? There are some stories you can that were in print that you can't find online anymore, right? So mainstream news organizations are took them down later so that they could fit a kind of agenda, a contemporary understanding. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which will be the second to last one. This book is titled Digital Democracy, Analogue Politics. So I want you to talk a little bit about that interplay of a very kind of engaged citizen online, KOT, we're doing all these amazing things, Jadudi, all this stuff, right? But on the other side, official, the State House people, all these people, are also doing something. They're not ignoring this space. They're super into it, but they're also not handling it just with one kind of mindset. They're also really adaptive. And in a way, you kind of go 3 steps forward, then 2 steps back, and then they kind of outflank you, and then you come back on the other side. So tell us a little about that whole interaction between citizen, subject, between state, government, and the people.
My theory is part of the reason why so many technological advancements happened in Kenya in 2006, 2007, after the referendum, before the 2007, and just after the 2007 post-election violence. And my theory, as I put it in the book, is a lot of it is because the government didn't understand what the internet was and what it could be. And this is not a Kenyan thing, this is a universal thing. Same way that Egypt, people were able to organize protests in Tahrir Square on Facebook, and the government didn't know that 250,000 people had RSVP'd to a protest because they thought Facebook was for sharing pictures of your cat and your food. And so for a long time, the political potency of these spaces that we create, websites, blogs, Twitter, whatever, first of all, it reflects people's agency and people's creativity, that you make the space and people will take it. It reflects people's really savviness about finding political space in their societies if they feel like the squeeze of the repression. But governments learn. And I guess Egypt is also an example of this, and I think we're seeing this in Kenya now. The investment, just as an example, one study about the Kenyan elections last year found that the average the presidential candidate spends $5 million on a presidential campaign in Kenya. How much do you think the Jubilee administration spent on Cambridge Analytica? $6 million just on that one company. There's an adaptation that's happening here. People are starting to understand how these spaces work, what people are trying to do, what the energy is. And as they're trying to understand them, the space for freedom of expression, the space for open-ended political organization is contracting. And that means that we also have to adapt. That means that we also have to, as users, be more creative and be more innovative about how we access, occupy, deploy these platforms. I think on the point of erasure, funny story, and I put a sentence about this in there. I was writing about the press. There's a lot of stuff about traditional media in there. And I was looking up, okay, people who grew up in Kenya will recognize this event. Standard Media Group, former First Lady, goes in, a couple of people get slapped around. There's a standoff, right? I challenge you to go and look up that incident on the internet. It has been erased. It only exists as a cloned video on YouTube. It's gone. This is the space that we're occupying. I went to the archives, to the physical archives, to try and pull articles, to try and get them out. And at one point, the archivist looked at me and goes, "Are you sure this article exists?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure it exists. I have it in another format." But I wanted to see, I wasn't even looking for that article. I was looking for the context to say, this was the headline on that day, but this story was like a B story. The archives are such political spaces. An archive is not a neutral space. Studying African studies in Europe really brought this point home about how powerful an archive can be. When you read stories about independence movements, for example, in Nigeria, you think there was very little resistance, blah, blah, blah. And the first organized resistance against British colonial rule in 1929, Nigeria, 1929? Late 1800s, Nigeria was organized by market women. Look up the Aba women's riots. The person who found this information in the archives was not looking for that information, was looking for something else. But the archives of British colonial papers live at Rhodes House at Oxford. So the Nigerian researchers who are at the University of Ibadan, who are in Abuja, who are in Lagos, don't have access to that information. And so when you think about how people then see themselves, we think of ourselves as having accepted colonialism, that there was no resistance. But if you look at the complete archive, Kenya was only colonized from 1899 to 1963. It's actually a very rich history of resistance. And not just Mau Mau, Freedom and Land Army, Somali resistance, Nandi resistance. There's so much resistance in our archive that we cannot see and or access. So this, to me, that's kind of the underlying political ethos about this, that even in this 10-year period, which is a very politically significant, volatile, key historical moment, our archives are being cooked. Yeah, they are raking even the archives. And so the onus is on us as witnesses. I'm going to use your word. The onus is on us as witnesses. What are you going to do about that? Which is the reason why this talk, and I know you think, when will the women stuff kick in? Aha, here it is. This is why we wanted to have this conversation about why women must write. That doesn't mean men, you don't write. This is a special message, a shout out. Because archives are also gendered. And whose stories get told? Whose stories get preserved? Whose histories get preserved, right? As I said, I read every single opinion piece that was published in Kenyan newspapers between January 1st and April 30th. How many of those do you think were written by women? How many do you think were written by women who are not Ras Nawara or Muthoni Wanyeki? Right? No. There is so much labor that we have to put into marking our space in history. And when we do the workshops, I always tell the women that we train, I don't write for virality, I don't write for retweets, I write for the archive. I write for the person who's going to be me 10 years ago, going to the archive, opening a book and going, I don't see myself in any of this information. I write for that person so that that person, nobody else has to go through that experience again. And I think, especially for women, the obligation is even more urgent, especially for Kenyan women, because I'm in Kenya. The obligation is even more urgent because your stories are important, our stories are important, our experiences are important, our lives are important, our histories are important, and they're just not getting adequately captured.
Thank you. I'm going to open this up for questions in the next 1 minute. I'm going to spend that 1 minute just being Nanjala's fan. So just be strong. Nanjala, be strong. I want to say thank you publicly to you for opening the door for me. If there's someone who has gone way out of their way to not just open the door, but hold it open until I'm all the way in, it's Nanjala. She has made countless email introductions. She has given me so many opportunities. She's like, no, I'm too busy. Ask Christine to do it. I'm like, yes. This talk was about why it's important for women to write, and we've heard about that. But you are a living example of that. She's not just talking, like she does it, So thank you. Thank you. All right. Questions, and please just let it be a question. Don't start with, mine is to say something small. Oh, I just have a comment. No, a question.
I'm going to pick up on just the last thing that you were speaking about, which is that interface between digital democracy, analog politics, and that thing about, and you started off with it as well, that the women were not there when you went, and how much trouble you had as well to get into newspapers. And a tweet that you sent out maybe 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that was like, Kenya is in need of an independent newspaper. And I'm like, can we please talk about that and actually make that real? Because getting into newspapers is actually quite difficult. And like, I don't even know how. I blog, but I wouldn't tell you how to begin to send in an article to whom. What is the process by which those articles get evaluated, for example, to get into newspapers? What does it take, and what will it take for us to actually just make an independent newspaper and media space as well? Because you were also mentioning how you are on radio, also on Twitter, how you are on radio, and you're like, why don't we have radio stations that have discussions, like political discussions? So yeah.
So I guess, Nanjala, I finished your book a while back, so.
Hey.
And I guess one of the key, residential ideas or like struggles I had after finishing is like, it's a very good account of how social media has enabled Kenyans online to make other Kenyans be answerable to them. And one thing that I found quite, missing is instances of Kenyans being able to make, the political elite answerable to them. And I guess my key struggle then becomes, where do you view that journey towards making the political elite responsible? And where Kenyans on Twitter or in other spaces are, where do you think we are? Are we, to use whatever example you choose? Yeah.
Thank you. I just have a very short question. You said something on Twitter a while back, to paraphrase, that being conscious in Kenya is being in a permanent state of rage. I just want to know how you do not lose your mind.
Aisha. Aisha.
I just wanted to ask, so you've talked, we've talked also previously a lot about doing the writing, and you've just talked about the archive. We need to build the archive. And you earlier talked about how it's difficult for women to get published, for women to sort of get their stories out there, and I mean the struggle you had with your thesis. So the question for me is, we are writing, the women are writing, the marginalized are writing, but then a lot of times they're not being published. Or, like for me, it's being published the way I want to be published. Like, for example, I did a piece on something that I wanted it to be more inward looking, but because it was a news item, I had to make it outward looking. So I feel like the story I wanted to give was altered. So then, for my question would be then, how do we go about then to get these stories published in the places that they will, make that impact and, get out there? So how do we do it for ourselves? Because we can push and probe and ask and question out there, but then how do we, bring it in for ourselves?
Great questions. I'll start with the easy one. There's no guarantee that I haven't lost my mind. Like, the jury is still very much out on that. No, I mean, I think the easiest thing is find your tribe and protect them. And siyo yo kabila yenyu. But like, find your people who enrich you intellectually, people who challenge you spiritually, people who build you up, people who will pick up the phone when you call them at 11 p.m. and say, I'm actually losing my mind, who will offer you some kind of perspective. And I think that's a Baldwin quote. It's a paraphrasing of a Baldwin quote, because I draw a lot of inspiration from James Baldwin and how he did, because the States did drive him to a point of mental, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to turn into a mass murderer right now. And he went to France for a year and 2 years and came back and was like, okay, America, I'm ready for you now. I don't think a little bit of madness is necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think, if anything, I think as a nation, we're so conscious of not being mad and not being different and not being weird and not being seen, that I think we necessarily box ourselves in and don't try different things. There are a lot of things that I can say. I moved back to Kenya in 2015, and in the last 3 years, I can think of many things that I've done that people have gone, is everything okay? And it's because I think we have this culture of, this is what sanity means. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do that, and then you do the other thing, and then everybody's happy. And the moment you try not to do those things, then you push up against it. But find your people, protect them, defend them, build your own. You have the family that you're born with, but you also have the family that you choose, and really defend that. And I've said this on Twitter, and I'll say it again, this country will not finish me by force. Amen. This country will not finish me. So, how do we get free and independent newspaper? Right for the elephant. People are trying, and I think it's really investing in the spaces that people are trying to build, like the Elephant, Bright, Kali Media. There's so many people who are trying. Find people who are already doing something and help them do it well, do it better, invest in those things. It's not going to be an easy ride. If you talk to people who have built media, who have built platforms, you'll see that it can take even 20, 30 years for the returns to start to come in. But that's really where we're at. We're starting again, and we have to be prepared to put in the legwork with that. I spoke to a room full of journalists yesterday about this book. It went down really well. And there's a lot of stuff in here about media, and there's a lot of stuff in here about Kenyan media. And I think when I say to them what I said, I'll say to you what I said to them, what I said on Twitter this morning. The best advice I've ever gotten in my entire life, boils down to 2 words: be brave. That's really all you can do. You wake up in the morning, you decide to be brave, and you keep doing it. Right now, I don't think it's talent or skill or people that we're missing. I think it's actually that thing of, are you actually prepared to be the weirdo who's going to stand up and take the heat? So that's kind of how, I hope I've answered your question. Kenyans making the political elite, I mean, My Dress, My Choice is a great example of this. It's a great example of forcing the system to respond to people's concerns. I have said this in the book, and I will say this again and again and again. Social media is not a substitute for direct action. It will complement it, it will supplement it, it will enrich it, it will give it form, it will give it shape. It will never substitute the boring work of political change that needs to happen in this country. Yes. It can't. There are so many, first of all, just the numbers, and this is why I spend a lot of time on numbers, the sheer numbers of people who are off versus those who are online, the number of people who are completely disinterested in what's happening, not just even on social media, even on the news, right? Ras Nawara asked on his social media the other day how many people watch TV, and we're like, what's that? People watch TV, people don't watch TV news anymore, we don't get news on the radio anymore. So, the number of people who are right now existing in an informational vacuum, I think, is a problem. And that's not going to change because, and I love social media, I mostly. But direct action is really kind of where we're at. And I talked to a lot of activists who worked in the 90s, 97, 98, whatever space, and they'll tell you, you know, they had one strategy. We seem to have another strategy as people, progressives, in this day and age. The person who will knock this stuff out of the park is the person who's able to put those two things together. And that's kind of where we're at in terms of organizing. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't think that that's where the solution lies. I don't think more people using social media for social change is where the solution lies. I think it's going to complement something else. The challenge is, what's the something else? And I don't know. It's above my pay grade. Not being published, this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem for writers of color. It's a huge problem for women writers. It's a huge problem for anyone who isn't telling a certain story. And Chris will back me up on this. I don't say this in the lean-in sort of guilt, it's your fault way. There is a structural problem. I think it's important to recognize that there is a structural problem. You learn how to fight, and you learn how to defend your words a lot, every day. Every new editor who comes in, you start again. We build our own spaces, we occupy our own spaces, we support the spaces that promote our work. That's another key part of it. Support the art that you want to see in the world. Support the writing that you want to see in the world. If you want to see more articles about running shoes made in Kenya, then go to the websites that are publishing articles about running shoes made in Kenya.
Written by Nanjala.
Well, I know the writer. Buy one copy of the magazine, subscribe if it's affordable. Like, we have to actually support the spaces, because the spaces that we are playing second fiddle in don't need our money. So you can boycott, wait, this is gonna be recorded. You can boycott that certain newspaper from that large metropolis in the United States. That's vague. All you want, but the people who enjoy reading about Africa's disaster failure will keep giving them money. So the question is, are you going to keep banging your head against that brick wall? And sometimes you do. Or are you going to go to Elephant, Popular, all of these other spaces that will take you as you are and help you figure out what that voice is and amplify that voice? It's constant negotiation. I wish there was an easy answer. It's definitely a structural problem. A lot of it is just negotiation, and I think if there's a critical mass of us trying, maybe we'll start to see a difference.
Talks about building our own African media. Do you think
Yes. Right now, the big gap I see as a writer, as a consumer of media, all of those things, the big gap that I see is African long form, African feature writing. Nobody's really doing it. Very few spaces are actually willing to let someone write an 3,000-word essay about something that's not political and that's not violence, war, death. And I know that there are African newspapers, established ones, that are thinking about it, but are struggling to see what that looks like. I think that's actually something that needs to happen. Something like The New Yorker, but for African, for Kenyan, for, voices from the continent to tell their own stories on their own terms. Absolutely. I think there's a hunger there, for sure.
Hi. My question is is related to process, which is that when it comes to emotions, what guides you in terms of how hard you lean into that or not? I think the reason that a lot of us here find your work so resonant is because of how fundamentally, beautifully inseparable the personal and the political is for you. I think that comes through in all forms of your writing and in Twitter and the choice of venue. And obviously that comes, and that's not the same as just emotions and how emotional you are when you do your work. It's obviously much more than that. But how do you manage that? Or how do you be conscious of who else is trying to manage that and devalidate your emotions or your personalness?
Ooh, nice easy question.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that I made it from Mogadishu to come here. I think it was destined. So I just want to say thank you. Even if you wrote it for a very particular audience and from a particular place, I think it will apply to many of us. You're very particular about the location that we're here tonight. You captured, bookended your story and the story about Kenya and politics in a very geographical way. Could you have written this book had you stayed in one place? Or does mobility added maybe some chapters, some finesse, some extra emotions?
Great question. That's a deep question. No, don't give her the microphone. 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 She's a bully. Don't give her the microphone.
No. These are fantastic questions. Like, I need to take you guys to all of the panels that I do and just like have you planted in the audience to ask questions, because these are actually the kind of, when you have events like these are the kind of questions that you're like, oh, that's what I wanted to ask. The personal is political, absolutely, and I'm so glad that you said that, because again, there are those things that you do and you don't think anyone notices, but you just kind of keep doing them, and it's good to hear that people notice. Someone said to me once, be yourself, your whole self, your entire self, all the time. One of the hardest things that I think, as you become older, regardless of your social, political, economic, whatever background, people start to encourage you to put on masks, to be professional, to be bubbly, to be all of these things. And at some point, you sit and you ask yourself, well, who am I? And for me, feminism has really given me permission to be myself all the time and to not have to put on different masks depending on where I am. And I hope that more people will find that liberation in feminism as a political orientation and not just as a point of philosophical, vijuju, things, but to actually stop and think about what does it mean to live a feminist life? And men can live feminist lives also. And to live a feminist life is to constantly interrogate everything. Everything becomes a moment to think about who you are and where you stand, what you stand for, and where you see yourself in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think sometimes I do get overwhelmed. Like I said, the 2017 election was a really difficult one for me. I did a lot of writing and a lot of thinking about the election in public, and tried to keep it very agnostic. But one day, I should stop telling the story.
Just tell.
No, I should stop telling the story, but I'm gonna tell the story. Okay, so I write this article, and keep in mind, I have a background in African studies, and Aisha will know this story. I have a background in African studies, I have a background in law. This is one of those moments where all the planets aligned and you are the right person in the right place at the right time. When the Supreme Court judge says, the election is null and void. Wait, I can read a constitution. I can read the law. I have a platform. Yee! So you write the article, you put it on Al Jazeera, it gets published, and a certain young man tweeting from Johannesburg sends you a tweet that says, you remember? There's so many people who have no idea what's happening in Kenya, and this is one of them. I was like, oh, you know what? Oh, we're about to fight. On site. On site. And it's one of those moments, to go back to the previous question, where I really felt my people. Like, I really felt my tribe. Like, I felt like so many people came through for me. I didn't have to swing once, but I was ready to go. But I didn't have to. And that was a tough one, right? Because that is a moment in which your expertise as an African woman is being publicly undermined because you're an African woman writing in Africa about Africa. You can't be impartial. You're all tribalists. Women don't, you can't know this. You're just writing for hype, right? And I think I would advise the opposite of what most people advise. I don't think leaving your emotions out of your work is good. I think putting it in there and learning how to put it in its proper place is a much better move. It's the feminist move. The personal is political. Every decision. You will see, those of you who read the book, please all of you read it. You will see in the book, I hope that you skim through the citations. Who is cited? Whose voices get amplified? Who is on the back cover? Who got to blurb this book? Whose names I put on the back cover? Who is in the theory section? Whose voices are in there? That's all political. That's all a decision. And a lot of it has to do with, tell Kigura I said hi. With the many, many, many conversations that Kigura and I have had, online, offline, in person, about what we want our academic work to look like. The second question, could you have written this book if you had stayed in one place? I don't know. And so what I'm saying now is the answer of a person who actually doesn't know and is genuinely challenged to think about this. Migration is a big part of my identity. Mobility is a big part of my identity. I travel a lot. I've lived in many countries. It's part of what excites me about humanity, and it's so embedded in my DNA at this point that it gives me perspective. And I don't know if I could have written this book if I stayed in Kenya. I know for a fact that I'm a completely different person from who I was when I graduated high school, X years ago. Age is a weird thing. I know that I'm a fundamentally different person. I know that my politics has been shaped, and not just by traveling to Europe, but especially traveling in Africa, especially going to Mogadishu, especially going to Kigali, and seeing people in their own element. So the short answer is I don't know. I struggle to see how. I think I would have written a different book, but I think I would have still written a book.
Last question.
I have the last question. Very lame.
Ask your question real fast.
Peer pressure.
What's your next book?
Finish your question.
Okay.
Okay, my question, Nanjala, something I didn't see in the book and I would like to hear your thoughts on are memes. I recently heard a rumor. You know how you hear things and you're just like, wow. I heard that whenever something happens in the political space or in the social space, that one of the jobs of the 36 bloggers and their descendants is to generate memes, to kind of dampen the anger, to divert the political organizing, to kind of whatever the mobilizing, right? And then you look at something and you're like, oh my God, Kenyans should be so angry, and instead memes are going viral about this thing. And I heard that this thing comes from government. I don't know if you've heard of this or what you think about this, because for me that's really terrifying, that the people who are in power are the ones who are both acting and reacting. You know, where does that leave us?
That's a great question. I'll answer this one first and then the other one. One of the toughest things that I grappled with when I was writing this book is how much common knowledge do you put in there? And as a researcher, you can't. You know, but if you can't prove it, you can't write it. Yeah. If you can't verify it, you can't put it in there. Mostly because I'm not trying to get sued. But I am, and as a user, it's something that I've seen. What I will tell you is that in Mexico, in the last election, not this one, actually the previous one, there was a government department that was created specifically to do this. That every time, every time a scandal broke out, that these guys would be paid to make something trend that was either completely banal and completely, just insipid, right? In order to quiet the criticism that was on them. It's something that has been done in elections in the Philippines as well. So the practice is definitely out there. I cannot say with authority that it's being done here. I can only offer conjecture, which is based on the experience, and my conjecture is 2 words: Gideriman, the end. And what's your next book? I'm excited to take all of the knowledge and insights and technique and everything that I've gained through the process of writing this book back to my first academic love, which is refugees and migration. And again, that also has origins in the 2007 election, because IDPs were at our doorsteps. For those of us who were in Langata, South C, South B, it was Nyayo Stadium, and trying to get food and all of these, provisions to people, it changed me fundamentally. So my hope is that the next project that I work on is going to be about that. My hope. I am working on a project about that. And I hope that it will be as interesting to Kenyans as this one is, because we used to have the biggest, we don't anymore because, long story there, refugee populations in the world, and I hate the way we think about what it means to be a refugee. I hate where our public consciousness is on this issue. I hate the fact that people think it's acceptable to stereotype, demonize, otherize people who have lost everything and are just trying to be safe. And I also hate the fact that we have these official systems. Now I'm getting into another sermon. Anyway, this is a long story, but I also hate the fact that our formal refugee protection systems are so bound by formality that they forget humanity. And they forget that people are people are people are people are people. So I tested this theory. I have a chapter in the book about this, about why people lie to refugee officers, and why we should really think about what we're making people do. And I'm hoping to flesh that out into a broader discussion about how we dehumanize people who flee conflict. The end.
Round of applause for both of them.
Kali Live is a production of Kali Media. Our executive producer is Paula Rogo. Our sound engineer is Moses Sospita. Our production assistants are Wairumu Kanyanja and Naila Mutheu. We recorded this episode at the Kenyan National Library main branch in Nairobi on December 7th, 2018. Thanks to Kenya National Library Services Chief Executive Officer Richard Masaranga Atutsi, as well as Beatrice Masharia, Kefa Nyaoga, and the hardworking team at the library. Special thanks to Tira Studio for set decor and our volunteers. And finally, thanks to Clara Wanjiku Odero for her immense help. For more information about future Kali Live events and our Kali Media podcasts, head to our website at www.kali.media. And let us know what you think of this recording. Who else would you like to hear from? And what other topics would you like to hear about? Our email is open, info@kali.media. Until next time.